And greetings. So, Professor Emeritus at Swinburne University, Dr. Richard Silberstein is with us. And Professor Silberstein has a PhD in neuroscience from the University of Melbourne. He's Australian. He also has a bachelor's degree in physics, which is where he started his career. And over 35 years of neuroscience research experience. He's the originator of a technology called steady state topography, which is a way of measuring how your brain is acting in response to things, and just in general, it's a brain imaging methodology. Has authored and co-authored numerous publications in a whole bunch of different areas of cognitive and clinical neuroscience. And just a personal note here, I'm constantly seeing these hosts on television talk about my good friend. I'm so happy to have you. I'm going to hand this over to my friend. I only have a handful of friends, but Richard is one of my very closest friends, and I'm so happy that he's visiting us from Australia on his way to speak at a conference in Italy to present a paper that he has. And so, Richard, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much,
happy to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for being one of my handful of real friends.
Ditto.
So I want to start out with, we're going to get into the neuroscience of how power corrupts people, but I want to start out with this paper that you're going to be presenting in Italy next week.
Yeah.
And it's essentially about the neuroscience of telepathy.
Yep.
Would that be a good answer?
It's a controversial topic, Tom.
I can imagine.
Yes, it is.
I mean, you've been just kind of a serious brain researcher your whole entire life. I mean, very well. You're literally one of the top neuroscientists in the world, well, and now you're looking into telepathy. I find that fascinating.
Yeah. Why am I going to trash my reputation? No, look. I've been interested in the nature of the way the brain processes information. And the things that I've been most interested in is a process known as functional connectivity, how different parts of the brain talk to each other. And we've made some interesting discoveries, particularly, for example, in relation to the relationship between attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and creativity.
Yeah, you wrote a paper on that.
Which I've written a number of papers on that. And interesting enough, it's something that you identified first in the 90s, long before anybody else had. So I've been interested in these particular features, and more recently looking at the neuroscience of creativity. What is it about the organization of brain activity in a person that's highly creative versus one that is less creative? And there are distinct features, which, fascinatingly, are very similar to the ones you see with ADHD, hence the link between ADHD and creativity. Anyway, I've been interested in the area of, are there anomalous weird processes that occur which in some ways seem to be inconsistent with our understanding of how things are meant to work? But I've seen reports of these over the years. For example, of all things, in the 1960s, there was a paper in the journal Science, which is a very prestigious journal, looking at these identical twins who seemed to report that they were aware of what the other one was doing, what was happening. And so, for example, they did this experiment where they had one twin in one room, another one in a separate room, and, for example, one of the twins put their arms in cold water with ice, and they measured the galvanic skin response, the sweating response of the other one in their palm. And there was this change that occurred coincidentally with when the other one was actually putting their arm in the cold water. And there's no way of interpreting that. Anyway, it was published and then sort of forgotten. Interestingly enough, the origin of why people started looking at the EEG, the brain's electrical activity, was due to that type of experience. The German neurologist Hans Berger, at the time of the First World War, was basically a field doctor, and he was involved in an accident. A horse-drawn gun carriage had almost run him over. He'd suffered minor injuries, but he was okay, but he was nevertheless taken to the field hospital. Now, this was 1916, or thereabouts. Within an hour, the field hospital received a telegram from Berlin, from his father, who was telegramming him to ask what has happened to you? Your sister sensed that something dreadful had happened to you. Now, this was within an hour or so of the actual incident. And that got Hans Berger interested in this thing called mental telepathy. Maybe there's something there. And his model for it was, well, there are radio waves. We can't see them, and yet they seem to be able to carry information. Radio waves require electricity. Let's look in the brain and see if there's electricity. And lo and behold, that's how EEG came about. So there's a long history, more recently sort of anecdotes, etc. And I was sort of interested, can you use the methodology that we developed in our lab, which is very sensitive at looking at these rapid changes in brain communication, and can we then actually see if they can give us an indication of interaction between identical twins without asking them, you know, did you see anything in your mind, etc., etc.
No, keep going.
Oh, right. Okay, sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So that's what actually led us to start this study late last year. It's something I've been intrigued about, and what we actually did was, do you want me to go into the actual design of the study?
Yeah, well, let me try to, you know, you shared with Louise and me this morning, you're staying in our house, and so we had, you did your presentation in our living room, which was just wonderful. And so this is how I understood it.
Right.
You have this extraordinary machine that you've developed that puts a bunch of electrodes on a person's head and measures brain activity all over the brain, and you're looking at the connectivity between different regions of the brain.
Correct, yep.
And whether that connectivity is going up or going down.
Yep.
And then you had two twins in different rooms in different parts of a building who were separated completely. And you show, and one twin is just looking at a simple picture or a simple image that doesn't change for the full period of the test.
Exactly.
Right. It's just a static picture.
Correct.
And the other twin is being shown a random picture that could be emotionally consequential or not, but is being shown a series of pictures about every 6 seconds, more or less, with a random number generator changing the time. And the twin who's seeing the pictures, obviously you're going to see a change in their brain activity when the pictures pop up. But the question was, will that same change in brain activity or something anomalous to it, or analogous to it, show up in the other twin who's just, you know, in another room far away, just staring at basically a simple graphic of some sort. So did I describe it?
You described it very, very well.
So what happened? What did you learn?
What was fascinating was this. We looked at it with 10 individuals, 5 sets of twins. Now, we recruited these twins through social media, and what we were looking for were twins who believed they had experienced some sort of telepathic interaction. In other words, when one twin suffered something or fell, another twin sort of felt the pain, even though they were a large distance away.
Well, you have one example that the parents told you about.
There was one remarkable example of what the parents described for one of the twins. I won't mention the name, and this was a fascinating one where these 2 young girls were in training for netball training. It's a bit similar to basketball. And they were in this large area, stadium area, and there were different courts in different areas. They were not in sight of each other. And what happened was one of the twins fell awkwardly and dislocated her knee. Quite painful, obviously. And she obviously got up in pain, hobbling. What was fascinating was that the other twin, in another area of the court altogether, who didn't see that, suddenly felt pain in the same knee and started hobbling. And when the coach had managed to relocate the knee, shortly after, because apparently coaches know how to do this, the other twin suddenly felt that there was no pain in the knee. Now, this was just something that the parent just happened to mention by the by. Now, look, that's an anecdote. That's not science. But there are so many of these sorts of anecdotes. And, you know, there are books being written, you know, one by Playfair called Twin Telepathy, which is basically a fascinating collection of these sorts of incidents. And I suppose that's what led me to think, well, wait a minute, let's look at a situation which is likely to maximize the chance of some sort of observation of interaction between the twins. And that's why I was looking at these changes in brain connectivity when one twin is seeing just a series of images coming up roughly every 6 seconds, but you don't know exactly when. And if you synchronize your analysis to the timing, well, obviously you'll see brain activity changes in the twin that's seeing the pictures. No big deal there. But I thought, what happens if you use that same timing and look at the other twin that's just looking at a static image? There's nothing happening, just one single image. You shouldn't see anything. And in about a third of the cases, we do. And statistically, it's quite a strong effect. And that's, in fact, what I'll be presenting at the Science of Consciousness conference in Sicily later in May.
Yeah. And the effect was not a small one.
It was quite a robust one. We got in statistics. There's this idea of what's called a probability value. What are the chances
p-value
of the p-value? What are the chances of seeing that just by accident, by a fluke? And you want that p-value to be as small as possible. 5% people call that, oh, that's significant. In other words, the chances of 1 in 20 of getting that. I was getting like 1 in 10,000, 1 in about 2,000 or 3,000 chances of getting that effect. So we were seeing pretty strong effects.
And did the twins tell you that they were, or did the receiving twin, I guess the sending twin, the transmitting twin was just seeing the pictures changing. The receiving twin was seeing nothing. Did the receiving twin tell you that they noticed any change in their mental state?
Well, that's the interesting part. No, there was nothing. They didn't report anything. And this is one of the problems with this field of research, where you rely on people's conscious awareness of what's going on. Because I suspect, and what we now know from brain studies, is there's a lot going on that we're simply unaware of that's happening in our own brain. And that's why we tried to avoid asking people, did you see anything? Did you hear anything? No. We were mainly looking at just their brain activity.
Remarkable. We'll take a break here for just a second and we'll continue. I want to get into this conversation about the how power corrupts people, how it changes their brains. We'll be So welcome back. Richard Silberstein, excuse me, is with us. And Richard, where do you go next with this?
The work on mental telepathy, etc. Well, what I'm looking at is the brain activity correlates of this phenomenon. And one of the things I'm intrigued with is, to what extent do these processes operate in everyday life? And what happens if they become disordered, deranged in some state? Could it be that, for example, some aspects of mental illness may be associated with, aberrant or abnormal activity in networks that are involved in this sort of process? And does that influence the way that they may be treated in a more efficient fashion?
Yeah, you can just let that drop.
Okay. Right.
So, wow. Wow.
Look, more fundamentally, it says something more fundamentally about what is a human being, philosophically, because the traditional, the most common view of what is a human being and what is consciousness is basically what the brain does. It's as simple as that. And that's what you could call the monist materialist view. There's one substance and it's physics, matter, and that's the basis of everything. And that's the sort of most common view. Now, the point is that if that is correct, if consciousness is just what the brain does, then consciousness should be limited by what physics says it should be limited by. In other words, there are certain limitations that the laws of physics apply. So the point is that this telepathy experiment that I've looked at, if you want to call it that, to be frank, it's not consistent with the laws of physics. That interaction should not be happening if consciousness is just the brain, just brain function.
What if it is radio waves? I mean, what if it is electrical activity?
Well, the point is that we've looked at, other studies have looked at, is telepathy due to electromagnetic waves? And there have been a lot of studies where people have been in shielded cages, these are Faraday cages, which basically shield all electromagnetic waves. There have even been studies where people have gone, senders and receivers have been, for example, in submarines, deep underwater, where the salt water basically of the ocean acts as basically a filter blocking all electromagnetic radiation, and you still get significant results.
Do you think that how might this relate to something like quantum entanglement, where if you split a particle?
Well, look, there is certainly a number of authors interested in this area have suggested that quantum entanglement, and this is really spooky and fascinating. Einstein hated it. He called it spooky action at a distance.
Right.
The notion that if you've got a single quantum state, for example, and that in turn creates two particles that are so-called entangled, you make a measurement on one, and instantly that changes the state of the other one, no matter how far apart they are. They could be literally,
100 light years apart.
13 billion light years, if you will,
Yeah.
the age
The
of
distance
the
of the universe. Yeah.
And so that's pretty spooky and amazing. And in a sense, a lot of people consider that as a type of a metaphor for what might be happening. Whether it is actual quantum processes, some have argued, for example, David Hameroff and not Wilder, Penfield, Penrose, the physicist, who just recently won the Nobel Prize, they argue that quantum processes are essential to consciousness. And I think there's some good evidence that they're developing. So quantum processes may be involved, but at this stage we don't know, and I'd be a little skeptical that it's pure quantum processes.
We'll be right back. Stay tuned. Hey, thanks so much for sharing our program and for reaching out to our stations and sponsors and letting them know that you're listening. It really means a lot to us. Okay, so welcome back. Richard Silberstein is with us, Professor Richard Silberstein, and you've been looking into how power corrupts and how it actually alters our brain. I think a lot of people are probably familiar with the studies. They got a lot of play here in the United States maybe 8 or 10 years ago, where they were looking at people at traffic intersections, and they found that the more expensive the car, the more likely the driver was to ignore the rules, roll through the red light, refuse to let the pedestrian cross, whatever. They called it the Beamer effect. Tell us about this. What is going on in people's brains?
Yeah, look, with more and more research, we now think that power, or more importantly, I think perceived status, the way you perceive your own status, seems to have an effect on brain organization and your behavior. I got interested in this because of the link between creativity and ADHD, and there was some suggestions that certain brain networks were involved in mediating some of these effects, and that's where I got to. There was a fascinating paper published about 3 or 4 years ago on what's called the hubris syndrome. It was published by a British deputy prime minister, ex-prime minister, and a psychiatrist. And what they did was they surveyed and reviewed the personality changes in British prime ministers when they achieved office and American presidents. Were there any consistent changes? And there were. And they were generally not in a very good direction. They tended to be more arrogant, less empathic, for example, etc. So they refer to this as the hubris syndrome. And I got interested in what might actually be happening in the brain to account for that. And I'm led to the view, I'm happy to sort of roll into it at present. Right. Essentially what seems to be happening is this. When your status when you feel your status has risen, so for whatever reason, you've got power, money, whatever, there are certain hormonal changes that take place, subtle ones. To begin with, it starts off with changes in testosterone, both in males and females. Both have testosterone. That in turn triggers a change in brain dopamine levels, not just brain dopamine levels, but the sensitivity of the brain to dopamine. Now, that's the sort of thing that's, of course, thought to be deficient in ADHD. It's not really that. And so quite a few of the stimulants, dexamphetamine, Ritalin, increase these dopamine levels.
As does cocaine.
As does cocaine, yes. Now, what we found is that dopamine suppresses a particular network in the brain called the default mode network. Now, this is the network that is most active when you're doing nothing in particular, just daydreaming. It's also the network that is the source of creativity. That's the one that comes up with new ideas. And quite often, that happens when you're not even aware of it. It's unconscious. Now you're walking along, suddenly the solution to a problem just pops into your head. That's the default mode network working. Now, that default mode network is inhibited by dopamine. And what that means is the other network, which is the networks that you need to perform tasks, doing things, reading, thinking, etc., those become more active because the default mode network and the task networks have a yin-yang relationship. When one's active, the other one's inactive, and vice versa. And you need both, obviously. Now, what is interesting is the default mode network is also important for mediating empathy. It's because of its relationship to another network called the mirror neuron network, which is the one that enables you to feel someone else's pain or discomfort when when, for example, they bang their finger with a hammer, etc. And what seems to be happening is this: your a rise in status causes an increase in testosterone, which also then triggers an increase in dopamine sensitivity. That starts to inhibit your default mode network. That then, in turn, reduces your ability to empathize, to understand other people's feelings, just intuitively, unconsciously. You start to see other people as more objects, things that you need to negotiate with or just use, etc.
You become more like a sociopath.
Exactly. You become, in the extreme, a jerk.
Yeah.
And basically, that doesn't mean it's inevitable.
Right.
But you need to be aware of it, and you need to be able to take account and more or less make an effort not for it to happen.
Right.
There's a famous example in ancient Rome, which is associated with generals. Once they've won a great victory, for example, they're awarded a procession, which is the greatest favor you can possibly have. And during that procession, when they're in their chariot, etc., there's a slave with them, holding a laurel above their head and whispering in their ear over and over, "Memento mori," remember death. In other words, remember you are but mortal. You are not a god. And
we need somebody like that for our
like
presidents and our prime ministers and whatnot. We just have 25 seconds here to wrap this up. How do people? I mean, we're not going to have somebody holding the laurel over our president.
No.
I'm not sure. I think with Jimmy Carter, his wife played that role. Frankly,
yes, yes. I think Jimmy Carter is one of the few that clearly.
And Barack Obama as well, to some extent.
Yes. Look, the issue is being aware of it.
Yeah.
Being aware, and
we have to wrap it up here.
Okay.
Richard Silberstein, thank you so much, Richard.
My pleasure.
Great. Thanks for being with us today. Don't forget, get out there, get active, tag You're It. We'll see you Monday.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.